The Parkinson's podcast is brought to you by the Davis-Phinney Foundation and brings you the stories, wisdom, and expertise of people living with Parkinson's, care partners, and Parkinson's professionals. Hello and welcome to the Parkinson's podcast. My name is C. Euros and I'm your host with the Davis-Phinney Foundation. Today we're joined by Amy Carlson, who's a recent winner of the Moth Grand Slam, which is a prestigious storytelling competition where participants share their true and personal stories. The Moth is a nonprofit organization that celebrates the commonality and diversity of human experience through the art and craft of true personal storytelling, and they have events all around the country. Hi, Amy. Thanks for joining us today. Could you introduce yourself and tell our listeners about your journey with Parkinson's and the Moth?
Sure. Hi, my name is Amy Carlson, and I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2012 at the age of 44. So now I guess that means I've been living with the disease for 12 years. And that's a long time, I think, actually. And so my journey with Parkinson's has been interesting. I feel like I have a good response to the dopaminergic drugs, which I think is a lucky thing for me. I know that some people don't get as good of a response as I do. At the same time, I would say that things in the beginning careened wildly. It seemed to come on very fast for me. And in fact, my differential diagnosis for a while was MSA. And then things settled out. So I'm not sure why things accelerated so quickly in the beginning for me, but I would say that since then, the road's been pretty smooth, as it goes with Parkinson's. I retired from my job about 4 years after my diagnosis. I was a construction program manager and I'm a civil engineer. That was just too stressful of a job. And I had a lot of transitionary issues, trying to figure out who I was and what I was after leaving a long-standing career was difficult. But here I am now, and I would say that the Moth is one of the things that has made life much more exciting and challenging and interesting for me as a person living with Parkinson's disease who's no longer engaged actively in a career.
And so what exactly is the Moth Grand Slam, and how did you become involved with storytelling?
So I've always loved story, and I've always loved storytelling. I've been a writer for a long time as a kind of an avocation. And I got into the Moth mostly because it was an opportunity to keep up my voice. Because as a person living with Parkinson's, I'm very concerned about my ability to communicate. And I want to make sure that my voice maintains a certain amount of solidity. And so by doing some public speaking and working on public speaking, that was a way to continue training my voice in addition to singing. The Moth has been around for a while, and it's really cool. If you ever listen to their stories, they're really fun. And I think it's one of the niftiest concepts I've ever seen. If you can imagine a moth around a fire, light and people telling stories around a campfire, that's kind of the idea of the Moth. So you walk into this event, and what you can expect at a Moth storytelling event in your city is a bunch of people who like hearing stories and telling stories. And everyone will come into the room, and some people who are brave and excited will put their name in a hat and say, I'd like to tell a story. There are some people who just take a seat. They want to hear a story. And then there are a few people who've been there before once or twice, and they'll raise their hand and talk to somebody early and say, I'd like to judge the stories. And so at the beginning of the night, basically what you have is a crowd of people. And shortly after the night starts, you have storytellers in one group, you have audience in the other part of the group, and you have judges in another group. So there ends up being 3 teams of judges, and one by one, they pull names out of a hat, out of the storyteller hat.
Is it random?
Random. The first 10 people they pick out of the hat, and they pick them one at a time. You pick one, that storyteller tells a story, then they pick the next one. So you don't have any idea if you're going to speak on a given night or not. That's how a regular story slam works with the Moth. And so I started doing those around Los Angeles and had a lot of fun, loved hearing the stories, loved telling stories when I got picked, and just had a great time. And one night I won. So I not only was picked to tell the story, but I told a story that the judges really liked, and they said that I was the best storyteller that night. If you win a slam, which is very exciting in and of itself, I mean, I've won one slam, and I've gone to, I don't even know how many, but I've been picked probably 20 some times, and I've only won once. And that's actually, I've heard that that's even a really great statistic, that most people go a lot longer before they win. And then if you win, what happens is then the 10 winners in the city, once they have 10 winners, they do a Grand Slam. And that night, you know who's going to speak. And that night, those 10 top storytellers will compete with some judges. And the judges, I think, at this point are not random anymore. It's a pretty exciting night. And the night that I was there competing for my Grand Slam, for the Grand Slam, there were, I believe, 500 or 600 people in the audience. And did the whole, it's like a whole different deal. You know, now it's no longer this grassroots event, right? It's not that anymore. Now it's like we're taken backstage. There's a green room. They feed us food. Everyone there is been practicing their stories. We've all been assigned a coach from the Moth to help us prepare for this event. So it's it's a step up. And so that was pretty exciting just to compete in it. And then to win that was absolutely kind of astonishing for me. I was really absolutely blown away and surprised that that happened. And all I can say is it was the right story on the right night.
And did you tell different stories at each one of the Moth events that you did? And then did you select one of the ones you'd already done before? Or was it a whole brand new story that you told that night?
So every time you speak for the Moth, you sign your life away. No, your rights to the story, not the story, but that version of the story. And you cannot tell the same story twice to the Moth.
Okay.
So anytime you go to a Moth competition, it has to be a new story. And there's always a theme. I forgot to mention there's always a theme.
Okay.
And so your story must resonate to the theme. That's one of the rules that the judges actually are told. And you can't go over 5 minutes. Those are the two. I shouldn't say there were no rules. There are 2 rules, and that's about it.
Okay.
And it should be a story, not like a monologue. And the night of the Grand Slam, the way the Grand Slams work, is, again, it has to be a brand new story, and you get the theme about a month in advance. You know, you can't really prepare except for right before the event, which I think makes it kind of fun. You know, it makes it so it's not like you're still going back in your treasure trove. You come up with something new.
And can you tell us a little bit about that story, or is that also something?
No, I can tell you. I can even try to tell it again, but I'm not going to because, but I will tell you about that story because it's a fun story.
That'd be wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
The story that I told for the Moth, the Grand Slam, was about Parkinson's, and it was reflecting back. It was just a few months ago now, so I was 12 years into my Parkinson's journey, and I was reflecting back to year 1. And during year 1, I already was experiencing continence, and I was at a company conference, an all-women's conference for all the women who, not all the women, but like a bunch of top women at my engineering firm, and they were brought from all over the world. And I was at that conference. And I went to go to the bathroom and I couldn't get my pants off in time. And I absolutely wet my pants like down to my shoes. Everything was soaked. And I'm sitting there in the stall and I'm like, what the heck do I do now? And it was about that moment, about how I felt at that time, how all of a sudden there was all this clarity around what this meant to have Parkinson's disease. At the same time, I found a lot of humor in the event. The story comes across, I think, pretty funny. A lot of people laughed, so I think that's a good thing. And ultimately, how that turned into a very positive event for me, if you can imagine, that wetting my pants led me to a bounce in my career, an upward bounce. It was a fun story to tell. It was fun to see people laughing at what could have been a really sad moment, and that I found it was fun. And I think if I had to tell anything to anyone in the audience about the Moth and why it's relevant to Parkinson's, I feel like the more I own my story, the more I take control of my Parkinson's story, and I tell the story, and I tell it my way, gives me a whole different perspective on living with Parkinson's. And by going up in front of an audience of people and saying, how do I want these people to hear this story? How do I want people to understand me as a person with Parkinson's disease? For me, giving myself that challenge has been really instrumental to, I think, having a very positive feeling about my Parkinson's, feeling like as much as possible, I'm in control. I have no illusions that I'm in any amount of serious control, but I can control the way I feel about this, and I can control the way I live with this. Competing in the Moth events, going to the Grand Slam, has given me a lot of confidence around my story.
What advice would you give to others living with Parkinson's who might be considering sharing their story?
I would say go to a Moth a live Moth event. First off, live storytelling is a lot of fun, and the stories are great and very exciting. And you'll have a good time just being an audience member. And most people would say the first time you go, just be an audience member. Don't try to sign up for anything too exciting. I, of course, am not that person. So my first Moth event, I did put my name in the hat and I did get picked, which was lots of fun. I don't know if I would recommend that. I had a lot of fun doing it, but it might be daunting. So one of the best things I think about getting into Moth more seriously, and by seriously, I mean I just do it a lot, is that I find myself prepping stories even though I may not get picked. I mean, sometimes in Los Angeles, there can be 40 or 50 names in the hat. So if they're only going to pick 10, odds are you're not going to get picked every time. But the fun thing is actually getting yourself to tell your story, even to yourself. And that's a really important part of this work for me. It's not just about the glamour, if you can say that, the glamour of getting up on stage and that sort of thing, competing. It's also about how am I going to tell this story to myself? How am I going to tell this story to someone else? And I would say the number one thing, again, that this has done for me is help me make sense of something that feels very much out of my control and very much sometimes doesn't have sense. So if you were to do this for the first time, I would say go to a Moth event and see what they're like, even if you don't want to go up on stage. The next time, figure out what the theme is and figure out what your story would be if you were going to tell your story. And then whether you put your name in the hat or not, you've already done half the work. And then I would say if you get there, have courage, put your name in the hat. You'll never find a more supportive audience than a Moth audience. And people need to hear our stories, and they want to.
And I just realized I forgot to mention at the beginning that you're also an ambassador for the Davis Phinney Foundation. And I was wondering if doing the Moth had any impact on the work you do as an ambassador.
I think it's the other way around. I started working as an ambassador before COVID. I did speak at a number of our victory summits, and actually I'm speaking at another one coming up soon in Green Bay.
Oh, okay.
And that experience kind of led me to the Moth and doing more and exploring more with public speaking. And so those two things kind of work together. And so I would say that both of those things, and this kind of goes back to our original question about who I am and that sort of thing. This whole advocating for Parkinson's, becoming an ambassador, working with people who are newly diagnosed or even people who have been diagnosed for a long time to try to help them find meaning in this journey is what I've found to be my calling now. I'm no longer called to this world to construct giant telescopes in Chile or all the other projects I worked on in my construction career. I feel like my calling now is to try to help people understand how to live with this journey, and more than just live with it, how to celebrate it. Because I think many are called, but few are chosen. And we go through the world in a very different way from other people. Our brains see the world differently. We react to the world differently. And while some of that is a pain in the butt, some of it also allows us to see things that other people miss. And if I could do anything, it would be to give people who are diagnosed the gift of knowing that there is beauty and joy out there because of your Parkinson's, not in spite of it, but because of it. And that's sometimes a tough thing for people to swallow or even begin to believe. So.
And do you have any future, you said you were going to be speaking at the Victory Summit in Green Bay. Do you have any other future plans around storytelling or otherwise in the Parkinson's field?
In Parkinson's in general, I've got nothing else on the docket, but things always come up. I'm one of those people who doesn't plan a lot ahead anymore, mostly because, you make plans and God laughs, or at least when I make plans, God laughs. But yeah, actually, the Moth in Los Angeles goes all summer, all year round. In Milwaukee, where I often spend a lot of my time, it only goes during the school year. They take the summer off. So I'm looking forward to the Moth returning to a local stage in Milwaukee. And I'll be out there with the rest of those hoodlums in the audience trying to tell a story as soon as they come back in September. And then the times when I am in LA, I'll always try to pick up a Moth show here as well. So you just never know when you might find me talking about wetting my pants for an audience of 500 people or less, if it's a regular Moth. But It's all fun and games.
What do you do to prepare yourself emotionally and mentally before sharing a personal story like you have in The Moth with an audience?
What's interesting is that has changed over the years. As my Parkinson's has advanced, I find that my brain works differently. I used to be able to tell stories pretty much off the top of my head into the mist, just go, and I could do it. That does not happen anymore, not the same way. I typically now write my stories, which I never used to do. I used to baby bullet them, but I never wrote them. Now I write them in longhand or typing, sometimes using dictation any way I can to get it on the page. You know how hard that can be with for a person with Parkinson's. That can be very difficult. Then I work the story, kind of reading it aloud to see what 5 minutes is, because 5 minutes is a pretty short time frame. I see what can fit, what amount of information can fit and what can't, especially with my cadence, which has changed over the years and has gotten slower. And some of this is exercise is really valuable for me in my day-to-day life, because as I communicate with people, I experience that some people experience this with Parkinson's, having difficulty finding the on-ramp into a conversation, where people around you are talking and the flight of ideas is much faster than it is for you. And then also, not only that, but you also have this thing where people are talking and suddenly it's like my body doesn't remember how to get into the conversation. So some of that, being able to look through my words, being able to read my words, makes, first of all, my speaking better than it is when I'm speaking extemporaneously. Now, the next thing that's interesting, though, is can't memorize things at all anymore. Whereas I used to be able to memorize some amount of text, I find that is excruciatingly difficult now. So now when I prepare for a moth, I take that text that I wrote and I read it over and over and over again. And then I put it down and I tell the story, and I find that new things pop into the story sometimes. And it takes me in different directions sometimes. And little details change and that sort of thing. But I keep working with the story and working with the story until it's very familiar to me. And then I go up and get in front of the mic. And every time, my husband will tell you this, what comes out of my mouth in front of the microphone is drastically different than what was written on the page or anything he's heard before. But by then, typically, if I've done enough homework, it's still a very good story. Sometimes a much better story. So I do a lot to prepare for a storytelling event that I'm very serious about. But part of getting ready for a moth for me is the same thing I go through every day with my disease. And that is letting go and just letting things happen, and I stop trying to control every aspect of it. And I just get familiar with what I know and what I can do. And then I let go. And inevitably, it seems to work out that I have a lot of fun when I do that. So the process has changed, and yet I find it very valuable.
It reminds me a bit of, I was in acting school for a little while, and just the way that you would read a script again and again and again and again until it was like just like living inside of you, you know, and then it allows you to be like in the moment when you're doing the performance itself.
Well, and that is true. I mean, I've taken some acting classes since I came to LA. Typically when I'm here, I take one every week that is geared just for Parkinson's people.
Oh, wow. Nice.
And so when we studied Shakespeare is how I kind of learned that idea of just reading you read a monologue over and over and over again until it almost means nothing, right? And then you build the words back. If you do that with your own writing, when you're doing storytelling, it's absolutely jarring experience of what your story can become. And the interesting thing about that is memory is nothing more. We know this. Memory is nothing more than the story you tell yourself over and over and over again. Okay. The minute a memory is encoded, it is re-recorded every time you remember it. And eventually the story becomes the story you tell yourself, probably not much about what really happened. Okay. And that's why, eyewitness testimony is so particularly pathetic, because people we are not a camera. We are not audio recording devices. Our brains don't work like that typically. And so one of the things that's, I think, really positive about storytelling psychologically is the longer and longer you tell yourself a story and the more positivity you can bring to that story, the more it becomes true that that's the way it actually happened, because that's the way you're going to remember it. We could have all kinds of philosophical debates about what that means, but I find it very particularly useful. It kind of coincides with another, I call it a little Parkinsonian weirdness, that I've talked to a lot of people who have Parkinson's, and a lot of people I've felt have told me the same thing. They experience the same thing that I do. And that is that oftentimes we don't remember the hard parts of the disease. It's almost like our brain shields us from that, perhaps. I don't know. And this came about to me when I'd been journaling a bit about my Parkinson's. And I picked up and I don't normally go back and read my journals unless I'm looking for something. And then one day I was going back looking for something and I ran into an entry and I read it. And if I didn't recognize my handwriting, I would have swore to you it had never happened, because I couldn't remember that actually happening to me. And I read it and I thought, wow, did that really happen? I don't remember, so it was a very bizarre experience. And I think that the Parkinsonian brain kind of does that a little bit. It makes a little bit of Swiss cheese sometimes of what's in our perception. And so storytelling, by and large, sometimes helps keep some of those things alive. Also, storytelling, I think, gives you a chance to reframe things into a more palatable, perhaps, frame or whatever. But I find that I think that it's been very, very helpful.
It's like a helpful way to process.
Absolutely.
Things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And see things in a new light. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think there's a lot about what support group is like. And in some ways, the Moth is just like a giant human support group. Sure. It's not really about Parkinson's. It's just about life, and going out and telling your story and having people say, hey, I hear you. I hear your story. And it's important. There's something very, very, very validating and important about that.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. It's been such a pleasure to learn about your journey with the Moth and storytelling and Parkinson's. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Parkinson's Podcast. For more information about the Davis Phinney Foundation and to learn about educational offerings and community events for people affected by Parkinson's, please visit davisphinneyfoundation.org or dpf.org. This podcast includes information about Parkinson's and insights from our Parkinson's community. It is not intended as a substitute for treatment advice from your own medical providers.